There are links to books down in the description. You can follow those if you want to read more on either Luther or Jan Hus. I certainly recommend it. Also, don't forget to like or subscribe. It really actually helps the channel out immensely. One of the things that always sparks my interest are the number of things that people have learned or picked up here and there that are more or less urban legend. Stories about this period of history or that period, comments about the importance of X, Y, or Z. These things happen quite a lot, actually. One that I'm hearing more and more is the story of Jan Hus and his alleged prediction of the Lutheran Reformation. So did this happen? Did this actually occur in history? Well, the answer is, unfortunately, no. Let me go ahead and go through the highlights here. The story alleges that Luther and his Reformation were predicted about 100 years before by Jan Hus at his execution. Hus had been a reformer there in the Czech area. He had led more or less a revolt out, and in many ways, he was Luther before there was Luther. The only difference is that Jan Hus's Reformation, the Hussite movement, was more or less regional or located to the Czech regions. It did not spill over into an international event, at least not in the way that Luther's would. However, because of Hus's Reformation, he was given a safe conduct pass to come to Rome to answer for the charges that he had made against the Catholic Church. He does this. He is nevertheless condemned as a heretic. The safe conduct pass is then considered null and void because one does not have to keep a contract or a covenant with a heretic or schismatic. Hus is then handed over to the state, and the state has him burned as a heretic. This, of course, only embroiled the problem more in the area of the Czech regions, but it had not spilled over into the other parts of Western Europe. When Luther comes on the scene, though, one of the things that is important for him is to find examples of the Reformation, of his Reformation, in those who had gone before. Now, we got to get the order right here. Luther begins the Reformation through his understanding of the Bible and his nailing of the 95 Theses and his defense of those theses and other positions. Within a year or so of the 95 Theses, Luther begins to realize that there is something more afoot than simply a squabble over doctrine, that actually this is going to go quite badly. And at one point, he does seem to stumble onto the story of Jan Hus. In fact, it seems to be the case that Luther found Hus in the midst of his own turmoil with the Pope, and he takes a great deal of comfort by the fact that Luther isn't the first person to do this. And then famously, in the run-up to his excommunication and his trial at the Diet of Worms, Luther famously says, "Ja, ich bin Hussite," or "Yes, I am a Hussite." But he doesn't just say it to any old person, and he doesn't say it in any old place. He actually says it in Leipzig, at the Leipzig disputation against Eck. Leipzig, the university there, the theology faculty, actually were formed as part of a coming away from the Hussite movement. There had been a theology faculty in the regions that were now Hussite. They had left and founded the theology faculty at the University of Leipzig. So Luther isn't just saying, okay, fine, I'm a Hussite, begrudgingly. He is frankly, quite deliberately telling those who would oppose Hus that he is on the side of Hus. Now, after the Reformation is relatively finished, you might say, or at least the events of the early Reformation are finished, there is, of course, this connection between Luther and Hus. What begins to happen then is the story of Hus gets read as a precursor to Luther, because Luther had taken such comfort in this story. There actually was a play at one point put on in Wittenberg, a little show, that described Hus as the forerunner to Luther himself. And it seems to be that in the context of these stories, and even in this play, you see the emergence of this, frankly, myth that Hus had not only laid the groundwork for Luther, but that he had actually predicted Luther directly. And so you get this quote that his last words were that in 100 years, God will raise up a man whose call for reform cannot be suppressed. Now, just at face value, you have to realize, okay, in 1415, Hus is excommunicated. By 1517, off by just 2 years, it is said that in 100 years, God will raise up a man whose call for reform cannot be suppressed. There's two things wrong with this quote. First of all, the Hussite movement was not suppressed. It was actually quite thriving in the Hussite regions, in the Czech areas, in the Bohemian regions out in the east. It was not suppressed. The other thing is it's way too on the nose. I mean, come on. This is so foreshadowing. This is the kind of thing you see in Shakespeare, the foreshadowing plot line that all leads to Luther. This is absolutely not what happened at the actual trial of Hus. The story, of course, is repeated ad nauseum. It seems to be everywhere. And it's not a horrible story, as long as you know that it didn't actually happen. And it's actually not saying anything about Hus, it's saying more about Luther than anything else. Luther, you see, drew a great deal of comfort, as I've already said, from Hus. So the story is more about Luther needing Hus than Hus pointing to Luther. Luther needed to know that he wasn't the only person who had found these problems in the church. And when he got on the story of Jan Hus, he certainly found that. There are other reasons to note that this is not a true story, that this is a myth. For one, there are no Hussites waiting around for this 100 years to end to find out who's going to be raised up. The only people who seem to be talking about this so-called prophecy are those in the Reformation, and they only talk about it, again, after the Reformation. There's nobody in 1512, 1510, 1500 going, boy, I wonder when this prophecy is going to be fulfilled, this kind of thing. Again, you just have to put your common sense to part of this. But the fact is again, the story of Hus's prediction only comes from Lutheran sources. Does this mean that we have to mistrust this or that Luther lied? How dare you, Luther? No, that's not the case. For one, Luther didn't really seem to repeat this myth as far as I could tell. I've never found it in any of his writings. There seems to be something said about him. But also, this is the kind of thing that would be done. You see, there might be some playful action, some playful storytelling of the Jan Hus story. Probably what happens is over time, those stories, the mythological, the wink-wink veneer, you might say, the storytelling component of it, begins to calcify. And so what happens with a myth like this is it eventually becomes something that actually happened, when in fact it didn't. So that's the story. Luther and the Lutherans invented the prophecy of Jan Hus. They didn't do so maliciously. They did so, you might say, in a type of retelling of Luther's own story and how he used and needed Jan Hus. But Hus and the Hussites, 100 years before Luther, can certainly stand on its own 2 feet, and it didn't end with the execution of Hus.